Hi, I'm Lewis, also known as Scaffles, and last weekend I participated in the GMTK Game Jam. This year's Game Jam theme was Out of Control, which led me to create Gods of Hell, an arena action shooter in which you fight waves of demons in the fiery depths of hell. Looks fun, right? If you want to give it a go, I'll put a link in the video description. I'm really happy with how the game turned out, especially because I was working alone and using my own limited game engine. Let's take a deeper look into its development journey. The Jam theme was revealed at 8 PM, but my preparation for the Jam began a little earlier. To keep me fed throughout the weekend, I slowly cooked a gammon joint during the day, turning and drizzling with honey just to make it taste just so good. With the gammon ready, I was ready, and I patiently waited for the reveal video.
This year, for 2020, the theme is Out of Control. As ever, how you interpret that is entirely up to you.
With the theme in mind, I quickly noted down all of my first ideas and did what any good British dev would do. I went to the pub. I woke up the next day feeling like hell. The night was a little longer than I had anticipated, however I did enjoy myself. I looked through my notebook over the ideas I'd written down during the night and the suggestions from my friends. Some of the more notable suggestions were obviously Kanye, F1 cars crashing, and bow control, which my flatmate was particularly keen on. During the night I tried to flesh out an idea about a set of rooms in which you can only take one type of player controls in with you at a time. However, this and all the other ideas really didn't feel right to me, so I needed something else. During breakfast I remembered the band Battle Beast had a song called Out of Control, so I decided to give that a listen for some inspiration. And that was it. I knew what I wanted the game to be. Inspired by the lyrics of the chorus, you play the madman, unleashing chaos, defying hell. You are out of control. Once I knew what the game was all about, I decided to start coming up with the actual game design. Since my engine is quite limited, I decided on a top-down wave-based shooter. I figured I could create all of the required mechanics without a huge change to the engine, so I wrote down what I would expect in that type of game. This includes shooting and melee, which I boiled down to a directional attack. I also figured a non-directional blast could work as well. As for the waves of enemies, I thought it would be a great way to create more gameplay out of such a simple mechanic, if I was smart with the implementation. I also decided to find images to hone in on the aesthetic that I wanted for the game. I like the idea of the enemies looking like the robot demons in Futurama. I also like the idea of having demons torturing humans throughout the level, and the way you gain lives was to possess those humans. Once you possess a human, you'll gain a different power or control, which I took inspiration from Rick and Morty for. With this in mind, I took to Trello to plan the rest of my day. Since my aim in the Jam was to finish with a complete game, I really had to boil down a lot of these ideas to their simplest forms. I decided to split the game into two stages, the gameplay stage and the artistic stage. The gameplay stage would concentrate on creating player controls, the enemies and the lives you have, and the artistic stage would be to create the art for the player, the enemies, the attacks, etc. It would also be for creating game menus, such as settings and the introduction screen. I decided I wanted to finish the gameplay stage at the end of the day, and spend all of Sunday on the artistic stage. So with little over 32 hours left, I branched the Project Torum codebase, and I was ready to begin working on gameplay. I started off by working on player movement, drawing where the player is and getting the player to move when you press the arrow keys. I then moved on to player attacks. When you click, the player will turn to face the mouse and a projectile will head in that direction. The cool thing about these projectiles is that they are highly configurable. They can have different firing speeds, sizes, damage, travel distance, loads of stuff. They're really good, and I figured I could utilise them for both the player and the enemy. With the basic player controls sorted, the game needed enemies for you to attack, and to attack you. Like the player, I started off with basic movement. the enemy needed to head towards the player, which worked out quite nicely. I then needed to get the enemy to interact with the projectiles that the player shoots. This just needed a collision between the projectile and the enemy to apply damage and knockback. Once I had the enemy taking damage, I needed the enemy to deal out damage. So when the player is in the enemy's attack range, the enemy will stop and shoot at the player's position. With the upside of this meaning the player is always on the move, trying to avoid being shot by the enemies. Once I had sorted the enemy AI, the game needed the ability to spawn enemies to provide a challenge to the player. I knew if I wanted the game to engage the player and have depth, I needed an interesting spawning system. The main inspiration for the system was the fight caves in RuneScape. In the fight caves, each tier of enemy that spawns will spawn the previous tiers with it in a pattern like this. However, after some testing, I figured the game would need higher amounts of enemies, so I decided to create a system based on the Fibonacci sequence. Now, after some distance from the jam, I realised I didn't quite create the system I had intended. However, it's close enough. This is how the system ended up working. Once a wave finishes, a new wave begins. This increments the wave counter. During the wave, the numbers of the Fibonacci sequence are iterated. The number in the sequence indicates the number of enemies to spawn, and the tier of enemies to spawn is the current tier minus the index of the Fibonacci number. In this case, we are on wave 1 and we have tier 1 as our maximum tier, so we ended up spawning 1 tier 2 enemy and 2 tier 1 enemies. This happens each wave until the wave counter is bigger than the total amount of numbers in the Fibonacci sequence. When this happens, the wave counter is reset and the tier is incremented. This changes the dynamic by allowing different enemy types to spawn. During the jam, I think I overcomplicated this system, and if I had time to redo it, I would have. However, since it was during a game jam, it was sufficient and provided the illusion of a clever wave system. At this point, the gameplay was really coming together. All I wanted to add was what I originally thought of as lives, but they ended up turning into pickups. These pickups are temporarily available per wave, and they provide a different projectile for you to shoot and can heal you. Unfortunately, due to the lack of health bars and visible weapons, it's hard to notice the benefits they bring, but I assure you, they do bring them. Finally, I finished off the gameplay stage with some smaller tweaks. These include changing the player colour at low health, stopping the player from walking off the screen, and adding some breathing time between the waves. With the gameplay looking good, the artistic stage was next. I had planned to work on this on Sunday, however after a whole day of playing with squares, I was keen to create a cool looking sprite. So I fired paint.net up and I created my first sprite. This is the sprite I created. It's a demon from hell, so I figured it would create a great enemy. The following morning I animated the sprite and got it working in game. I was particularly happy with this and decided to move on to the player sprite. Unfortunately, I really hated the sprite I had started for the player, so I decided to stop working on it. In the hope of establishing a design style, I took the first enemy design and adapted it significantly to create a second enemy. After the second enemy was finished, I gave creating the player sprite another go. In the end, I wasn't wild about the design, but I thought it looked a lot better than the original attempt, and when seen in game, it didn't look too bad. The last things I drew were a sprite for the pickup, a target for the mouse cursor, and the background image. These were all fairly basic, but they served their purpose really well. At this point, the game started to feel good. The gameplay was working and the main art was in place. I then ported the settings menu from Project Torum and created a basic start menu. The last thing I needed was sounds. I don't have much experience creating sounds myself, so I went on opengameart.org to look for music and sound effects. I found some music, a shooting sound, demonic noises, and a couple of other things that I thought worked really well and added to the atmosphere of the game. At this point I was finished. Everything the game needed was in place, so I created a release build of the project, captured a few screenshots and uploaded the game to itch.io. I managed to get the final release of the game done about 30 minutes before the closing deadline, and I had a little bit of chocolate to celebrate. All in all, I think this was a fantastic weekend. I got to eat good food, drink at the pub for the first time in over 3 months, and create a fun game. I'll definitely be looking for other jams to participate in the future. As for the game, I thought it turned out great. I have a whole list of changes that I would have liked to have done to it but didn't, mostly because of the game engine limitations. Hopefully by my next jam I will have implemented some of those features such as particle systems, health bars and camera shake. Thanks for watching this devlog going over my experiences for the GMT Game Jam in 2020. Don't forget to click the like button to let me know you enjoyed it, subscribe for more development content, and try out the game, link is in the video description. Thank you and goodbye.